0. Ladies and gentlemen, a very special guest tonight on the show. She is a repeat guest and a fantastic interview at that. We're talking about Jennifer Marohasy. She is an Australian biologist, a columnist, an author, and a blogger. She was a senior fellow at the free market think tank, the Institute of Public Affairs, between 2004 and 2009, the director of the Australian Environmental Foundation until 2008, and she holds a PhD in biology from the University of Queensland. A recent specialty is work on actually being a scientist and diving on these reefs. And we're going to be talking about some of her work today on the show, as well as a book, Climate Change: The Facts 2020. Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Hi, lovely to be with you again. And yeah, everybody should go and buy this book, Climate Change: The Facts 2020.
And we will leave you links to the website.
And if they want to know more about... Yeah, and there's also the book by Peter Ridd, Reef, HERESY. Peter's got a chapter in this book, and then there's more about particularly the Great Barrier Reef in this book, Reef, HERESY.
Okay, awesome. So we'll have links to Reef, HERESY and Climate Change: The Facts 2020 below. But today we're going to start by talking about some of your recent work, and which you published on your website in a blog post. So let me bring that right up here. Measuring Old Corals and Coral Reefs, Part 2. You went on an expedition to search a very particular type of coral. And before we talk about it, you have a little video down here, if I could find it. Wow, it didn't seem that far down before. Oh, there it is. Okay, so this is a video of the High Island Reef. Do you want to talk about it while I play it?
That would be great. So High Island is an inshore reef. We did 2 inshore reefs, a reef that's a little bit more offshore, and then one that was right offshore. So the water quality is not so good at this reef, but you should be able to see, I can't actually see the video as you're showing it, but you should be able to see these really big boulder corals, really large corals. Are they showing on the screen?
We're looking at some more branching corals with a tape measure on it currently.
Oh, there should be really big boulder, big like little moons under the ocean. So they're boulder corals, they're parietes. So they can be 2-3 meters in diameter, and they actually have annual growth rings. And the Australian Institute of Marine Sciences used to core them, and from that coring, they could calculate annual growth rates. And the idea was, there was a lot published through the 70s and 80s explaining that as temperatures increase, coral growth rates are probably going to increase as well. So global warming is actually good for coral reefs, except that, of course, doesn't fit with the sort of popular narrative. So they've stopped coring these corals, which is a pity. And a lot of people think that all these corals are dead, but they're not. So, you know, you can go to places like High Island, which are right next to the mainland, and you can find these big old parietes corals. And I'd like the institutions to go back there, the AIMS, Australian Institute of Marine Sciences, to go back there and core these coral reefs. And probably what we'll find is that as temperatures are increasing, the corals are actually growing faster.
Interesting. Now, your blog post mentions the Lunar Standstill. And what's the significance there? We're going to get to that in a second, but just tell me what your take on it in the post is.
So what you'll find with these parietes corals at places like High Island is they grow quite close to sea level. And of course, sea level goes up and down depending on the daily tides, but you also get these exceedingly low tides that correspond with particular parts of the lunar cycle. So you get lowest tides every day, you get lowest tides every month, but you also get exceedingly low tides that correspond with periods of minimum declination, which is corresponding with that 18.6-year lunar cycle. And that also actually corresponds with years of particularly bad coral bleaching. So 1997-98 was a year of bad coral bleaching. 18.6 years later, 2015-16, we had years of bad coral bleaching. And if you look up your ephemeris, you'll see that those years correspond with minimum lunar declination years. So that's when the moon doesn't actually go as far north or as far south as it rotates around the Earth, because it doesn't go around the Earth in a complete, like around the equator exactly. It goes a little bit south and then a little bit north, and how far north and how far south depends on where it is in this lunar declination cycle.
Yeah, to be more specific, according to Wikipedia, a lunar standstill is the gradually varying range between the northern and southern limits of the moon's declination, which has a name, like solstices. When we talk about the sun, these are called lunastices. Very difficult word to say. I had to practice that quite a few hundred times. And these occur over the course of 1/2 of a sidereal month, or about 2 weeks. So there's a small standstill happening every 13.66 days. But the major and minor lunar standstills occur every 18.6 years. And so what you just said is that this is due to the precessional cycle of the lunar nodes. And what's very interesting about this, Jennifer, is that even Wikipedia says it here, that this time appears to have special significance for Bronze Age societies who built megalithic monuments in Britain and Ireland, also has significance in neo-pagan religions, plus other ancient sites and cultures, including here, where I live, the major lunar standstill at Chimney Rock, where the moon comes up between these two pillars, was discovered as recently as 1987. So absolutely fascinating stuff. What are your thoughts?
So yeah, you can see it in the tides, and obviously you're a long way from the sea, but you can see it presumably in the seasons and changes in the weather. And it would be so good if I guess instead of having this total obsession with carbon dioxide, some of our key institutions start to realize the effect of the moon on things like, there's no correlation with carbon dioxide and coral bleaching, but you can see a very clear correlation between lunar cycles and coral bleaching. So you can predict that the next really bad bleaching is going to be, for example, in 2034, which is your next big lunar minimum declination cycle, probably correspond with a El Nino event, La Nina event. Yep. So these are really important, predictable weather climate cycles that our civilization should be thinking about. But our Australian Bureau of Meteorology, it doesn't like talking about the moon. It doesn't like thinking about atmospheric tides, lunar influence, even sea tides and their effect on coral growth rates and coral bleaching.
Imagine the implications for agriculture. I mean, clearly, it would be my supposition that these ancient cultures in Europe and the natives out here, which were agrarian societies, that this lunar standstill probably had a major impact on farming. And that's why it was very important to them as far as the calendar is concerned. And it just blows my mind that we as scientists have not embraced the ancient ways in saying that myths are history. I'm sure you've heard that term. And the dogma is completely mind-blowing. And speaking about dogma, your work on the books that we're going to talk about, Climate Change, The Facts 2020, when was the first year that was published? Because I remember we had you on the show, I think maybe 2017. You had the same book going? Is that true? Has it been that long?
So we had a Climate Change, The Facts 2017, and that had a different lineup of authors talking about different issues. So Climate Change, The Facts 2020 is, well, some of the authors are the same. For example, Roy Spencer's in this book and he was in the last book, but this book has got a slightly different focus. The last book had more about the Great Barrier Reef, and the first chapter in the last book actually contributed to Peter Ridd's sacking because he was talking about corals and how growth rates are probably increasing with increasing slight increases in sea temperatures. This book, we've got another chapter by Peter Ridd, but it's actually not about the Great Barrier Reef. So it's a completely new, different, but a great book. This does have a chapter on sea level and sea level change and how sea levels in your tropics, tropical regions, vary a lot over that 18.6-year lunar declination cycle. So that website that you're going to tell people about, climatechangethefacts.org.au, it's actually got some fact sheets up, and there's a fact sheet on the chapter on sea levels, which is chapter 17, and you can go in there and see figure 17.9, which shows the extent to which for places like Kiribati, you haven't got sort of some linear increase in sea level with carbon dioxide as the media is suggesting, but rather you've got these cycles that correspond with your El Nino, La Nina events, and the extent to which that also then affects rainfall, which yes affects agriculture in Australia. It's the statistically significant correlations are extraordinary, yet still our bureau doesn't want to talk about this and the link to the lunar cycles, which is a travesty.
Yeah, indeed, as well as the sacking of Peter Ridd. Are there any updates on that? I know he appealed it. And what's the current status, other than he has a book out that everyone needs to buy?
So that's right. Everybody needs to buy Reef HERESY, which is a plain English explanation of so much about the Great Barrier Reef, how corals grow, but also why how we've been misled to believe that with the slight warming in the current cycle, we've got death of the reef when in fact we haven't at all, and how resilient the Great Barrier Reef is, as well as how beautiful. So back to Peter and where he's at in terms of this court case. So he lost in the beginning, then he won when it went to the Federal Circuit Court, and then it was appealed by the university, and it went to this full bench of judges who, for crazy reasons, he actually lost when they appealed. And so he's appealed again, thanks to the support of your listeners and others who contribute to his funding. So he's now appealed their appeal to the High Court in Australia, and he's actually got the High Court to hear whether they're going to hear his appeal.
Wow.
The lawyers make so much money out of all of this.
It's insane.
So the hearing to see they're going to hear it is on the 11th of February. So we need everybody to be, I guess, hoping that the 11th of February, which is very soon, is going to be a good day for Peter, and they're going to actually then take it forward and hear his appeal in the High Court.
Well, we'll send all of our good vibes out there for the hearing to hear the hearing.
Thank you.
Now let's talk about one of the authors in Climate Change: The Facts, Roy Spencer. He's been in both issues. If you've been following his satellite data, the UAH global satellite temperatures, you would have noticed that the last month the temperature point dropped quite significantly back to a similar time, maybe in the 80s and the 90s, where now global average temperature is only up 0.27, I believe, but it was a 0.34 degree drop or something in that neighborhood. So one of the most significant coolings in years, and a lot of people are attributing it to La Nina, which I would concur. the meridional flow, breakdown of the jet stream perhaps. But that is a significant cooling during a time of global warming, and the mainstream didn't tell anybody that. So what are your thoughts on that cooling? And do you think we're going to continue to cool for another few months? What are your thoughts?
So, talking about Roy's chapter in this book, which is chapter 6, he actually focuses in, because we've got one section of this book focuses in on the Antarctic and the Arctic. So he particularly focuses in on temperatures at the Antarctic and the Arctic, and sea ice in the book. In terms of the recent cooling, I haven't been up to date. I've been spending a lot of time at the Great Barrier Reef under the water, but certainly, and just to come back to that, I mean, his global satellite monitoring is so important, and it shows that 1997-98 warm spike, and then the 2015-16, and to labor the point, to repeat myself, that corresponds exactly with your minimum declination periods, so the periods when the moon doesn't go very far south and very far north in that 18.6 year cycle. So in terms of whether it's going to be cooling or warming, I was doing a lot of forecasting, particularly of monthly rainfall, and I've published a lot on that. And to do that, I have to be running my neural networks, and I haven't done that now for 18 months. So I'm not going to have an opinion because I haven't run my neural networks over the data.
Wow. Do you need
How boring is that?
It's pretty boring. But, well, you could enlighten us with some more fascinating. So how do you get funded to do the research on the reefs? Are you just pulling it out of your own pocket?
So the last trip that I did was funded by the B. McPhee Family Foundation through the Institute of Public Affairs, and the idea is to make a documentary, another film about that, but to also actually start gathering some data from the transects, because I have really spent much of the last 10 years working on monthly rainfall forecasting and climate cycles, and that's fairly lonely work, and you don't have lots of pretty pictures to show and explain the cycles. And then I haven't got a lot of funding for that. With Peter Ridd getting sacked, which was partly my fault, I've decided to focus very much in on the reef, where you can not only see the cycles, so I was looking with my rainfall forecasting work at your atmospheric tides, I guess, and you can see them in the numbers across the Pacific to forecast your El Nino, La Nina events, but you can actually visually show them in these varying tide heights, and then see the correlations between your global extremes of temperature as per Roy Spencer's satellite work, and then these big coral bleaching events. But nobody's going out there and actually filming, I guess, or showing the complexity of these coral reefs, for example. And in that blog post that you refer to, I show some of the big boulder corals. I talk about how they can be cored, and how the key institution has stopped coring them. But I also talk about how, instead of reporting on growth rates that are probably increasing with the slight increase in sea temperatures, what they're doing now is they're just flying over these coral reefs at great altitude, and looking down at the reef crests, which are always the most eroded and denuded part of the coral reef. And they're saying the Great Barrier Reef is 50%, 60% dead, which is really quite unfair, because you've got different habitats within a coral reef ecosystem. And what, particularly with the last expedition that we did in December, we took all these aerials with drones and showed that at 120 meters, which is about what they're flying over at, you can't actually see beyond the reef crest. You can't see the big Porites corals in the lagoon 10, 20, 30 meters under. If you are going to honestly report on the state of a reef ecosystem, you need to actually get in under the water. And you also need to distinguish between a reef crest and a reef lagoon. So I guess at the moment I've got some funding from the B. McPhee Family Foundation to get started on this, but I might be coming on your program in 6 months' time asking for more support to build on that work, to show that you have to get in and run some transects on the reef slopes, down the walls. You know, there's a lot of coral from my video that you'll find at my website, Clowns on the Ribbon's Edge. There's a lot of coral growing vertically. And, you know, and they're pretending that they can survey them from 120 meters in the air. And, you know, these institutions, there's nobody out there calling their bluff. Peter Ridd said there needs to be some quality assurance of the science. He got himself sacked.
Yeah.
So he's pursuing it in the courts. I'm trying to provide some backup by actually getting in there and showing people that there are these Porites that they used to core. They're not coring them anymore. The Porites are not at the reef crest. It's only the reef crest that they're flying over, and reporting that all the Great Barrier Reef is dead. I mean, that might sound extraordinary that you've got your leaders of what they're calling centers of excellence reporting on 60% of the Great Barrier Reef being dead, not by getting under the water and having a look, not by looking at the corals in the back lagoons or down the walls where we know that they're growing beautifully, but flying over the reef crest. So the reef crest is the very top that on the that during the periods of very low tide gets exposed, and that's the area that's going to bleach first and bleach worst. And when there are cyclones, that's the area that gets smashed the most.
Yeah.
And do you know what? Because you would know, we've actually had 1.5 meters of sea level fall since the Holocene high stand. Most of that reef crest is dead anyway, not from the last 10 years or 20 years or 100 years, but from the last 2,000 years of sea level fall.
Yeah, we're not in the Roman...
You'd get that, would you, David?
Yeah, we're not in the Roman Warm anymore, but let's talk about this. So if the funding available is that for climate change and global warming, if you were a scientist, you would never want to put a scuba suit on and actually go look at the coral. What you would want to find is the most convenient way which you can prove that the coral is dead. And if that means flying in a helicopter at 80 knots, 120 meters above the reef, and claiming that, it's all bleached, and so that's what's happening here. It's simply propaganda being printed for funding dollars. Now, and I know this for a fact because even 20 years ago, when I tried to do some catastrophic geology stuff, the funding is just not available. If you're going against or not towing the line, then you're going to have to get no funding or limited funding. I mean, for my thesis, I only was able to get a few $1,000.
Or funding from a private philanthropist.
Yeah.
So my funding's from a private philanthropist through a think tank that takes no government money.
Beautiful. Because
all the government money is to support the current zeitgeist about catastrophic global warming from carbon dioxide, for which there are no correlations even for coral bleaching.
No, but what we do have is decades of papers which are garbage in journals all over libraries and universities worldwide, and it's embarrassing.
It is embarrassing, and a little bit of quality assurance shows the absurdity of this current program of flying over at 120 meters. Now, there are scientists who are getting in under the water and publishing the odd paper here and there, but the journalists, the media companies have a lot to answer for here as well, because they won't report on me going out. I've invited them to go out, key journalists on the boats that I've been on, be it to Bowen for the Beige Reef movie, or be it for the last expedition that I went. I invited several journalists. I said, we can make space for you on this boat. You can come, because we specifically went to the reefs where they used to core the parietes, and you can see, because there was this rumor that they're not coring the corals anymore to look at growth rates because all the corals are dead. I said, well, let's go to those specific reefs that don't tend to be dive sites and they tend to be hard to get to, and let's see if we can find some parietes. Come, we'll find a spot on the boat for you. They didn't want to come. There's a real reluctance to report on anything that doesn't support the current narrative, which is nonsense. It's just complete nonsense.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, our mainstream media is bought and paid for, and there's only 7 corporations. They all answer to the top, which goes in some cases to George Soros, connected to the World Economic Forum, and this whole push for this globalist agenda where we all get global basic income and it's carbon neutral, and it's just insanity. If you just do 10 minutes of research on the green energy movement, they're literally charging electric cars with diesel generators. The world has gone mad. It does not understand that 80% of everything is done with oil and gas, and the other 20%, which we call renewables, is made with oil and gas. So if you eliminate that, you eliminate everything, and it basically puts us back into some kind of a pauper state, and it's driving a lot of people batty. What are your thoughts on that? This has been a fantastic interview, by the way.
So there's the Michael Moore video, isn't it, that is so good, that of course came out. What's it called? Planet of the Humans? What's it called?
Something. But they're showing
the Michael Moore documentary.
They're showing the biomass plants that are just killing trees to keep this thing on fire.
And his documentary came out on YouTube, and then YouTube pulled it because, I mean, it's extraordinary. But it went up on Vimeo. So people should go to Vimeo to watch that Planet of the Humans by Michael Moore, which talks about exactly what you're talking about. So, and I've got, I'm getting my little videos up on Vimeo, but we're going to do, anyway, talking about this whole issue of you know, the Great Barrier Reef is one of the key icons in terms of this idea that, you know, we've got catastrophic global warming and it's destroying the earth. Of course, Barack Obama, he came to Australia, 6 years ago now? Was it that long ago? More than that. And he talked about how the Great Barrier Reef is dying. You know, he did that from a lecture hall at a university 400 kilometers south of the Great Barrier Reef. He went on about how you have to go and visit the Great Barrier Reef because it's all going to be dead soon, but he never visited the Great Barrier Reef. Barack Obama did not visit the Great Barrier Reef when he came to Australia because, I mean, he came and he made a fuss about the Great Barrier Reef as a reason for needing to be concerned about climate change and changing energy mixes and everything, but he never visited the reef. When you get up close to the reef, had he gone to, say, the most southern coral cay, the closest coral cay to where he gave that lecture would be Lady Elliot Island, he would have seen the most beautiful reef. He would have seen manta rays. He would have seen green turtles if he got under the water. It's just beautiful, but he didn't go and do that. They talk about the reef, but they talk about it from a distance or way up where you could only see the reef crest. You know, we need, and it's fantastic that people like yourself actually have a voice and have a capacity to get out to people who care and are interested in the detail. And I'm hoping over the next year or so to show people what it actually looks like underwater. And we went out to this place called Myrmidon Reef, and maybe when we do the next interview I'll show you out there and how crystal clear the water was and how beautiful the corals were in places, though at every reef you can see destruction from the last cyclone or from sea level fall at the crest and so on. But you know, these coral reefs, they're complex. If you look at the crest, it's different to if you look at the reef slope, it's different to the back lagoon. And the reefs further out, like Myrmidon, have a different the parietes even grow slightly differently to the mid shelf reefs to your inner shelf reefs. So Great Barrier Reef is it's complex, it's still alive, and you can still find beautiful corals if we're to understand the subtleties of the lunar cycles, and I guess your longer 60,000 year cycles and 120 year cycles, and any effect from the human caused increase in carbon dioxide levels. You need to do proper monitoring, and I'd like to put a proper monitoring program in place so that we can understand if there is any long-term increase or decrease in coral growth rates, changes in species assemblage with these with the climate changing, because you know the climate's always changing. Did you know that, David?
Yeah, I did. So and that's in fact what we've been talking about the entire time is cycles, climate cycles, driven by these other things in our solar system. The sun is number one, but what we found in this podcast is that the moon is not only important when it comes to very high tides and low tides, coral bleaching, but the health of a reef, and more importantly, ancient man knew it was important too, maybe for other purposes. So a fascinating podcast. Guys, if you don't know or haven't seen, check out Jennifer Marohasy's site. It is at jennifermarohasy.com. It's that simple. She's got some interesting stuff on there. And also what's interesting is at Climate Change the Facts, where you can buy this new book, Climate Change the Facts 2020, the fact sheets and the PDFs you can download for free are absolutely amazing. We'll also have links for Peter Ridd's book, if you want to hold that up one more time, so they can take a look at it. Boom, there they both are.
Too important.
Yeah. Which one is most important? I think buying both of them is. And Jennifer has a link where you can get them both, but we haven't been able to figure out where that is yet.
So this Reef Heresy book, if you're interested in the Great Barrier Reef and you want to understand also, if you want to understand science and how important it is to understand something, a complex ecosystem like the Great Barrier Reef, but also how it can be prostituted, I guess, to give people the wrong impression, and how there's such a need now for quality assurance of reef science. And if you like something that is sort of plain English, then Peter's book's important. That's a good one. Great Barrier Reef, plain English. How have we got to the current situation and what can we do moving forward? That's this book. If you want to know, and this book doesn't actually have anything about the Great Barrier Reef in it. That's Climate Change the Facts 2020. The previous one, 2017, had a lot about the reef, but not this one. This one's got 3 different sections. The first is about Antarctica, with a real focus on temperature change at Antarctica and looking at the satellite record. So that's Roy Spencer's chapter, looking at the instrumental temperature record, Ken Stewart's chapter. And then there's also a chapter by myself and John Abbott looking at proxy records going back 2,000 years for Antarctica. And there's actually a great chapter in here. The very first chapter is not about Antarctica, but it's about the Arctic, and it's by Donald Laframboise and Susan Crockford. So that's a really good chapter about polar bears. So that's the first section of this book. The second section's about what I'm really interested in, which is the need for us. Let's stop talking about carbon dioxide and start trying to understand and move towards a new theory of climate. So my interest in atmospheric tides and sea tides and lunar influence and solar influence and big data sets and artificial neural networks, most of my published work over the last 10 years, relates to this need for a new theory of climate. In this second section, we've got a chapter by Henrik Svensmark, which of course is all about cosmoclimatology. Really important chapter, chapter 10. We've got a chapter about water vapor, chapter 11 by Jeff Duffy. Chapter 12 is tropical convection cooling the atmosphere by Peter Reid. You know, Peter and I have been talking about tropical convection for 10 years. Now he's not so busy with his students at university. I said to him, write this chapter for this book, Tropical Convection chapter. It is so important, and it builds on the work of an important American meteorologist, Joanne Simpson.
Nice.
So that's a really important chapter. And chapter 13, Reflections on the Iris Effect, is by Richard Lindzen. I said to Richard, I want you to write about the iris effect, which is why changing cloud cover is a negative rather than a positive feedback. And he published all of this 20 years ago. He said to me, Jen, that is a really important paper that I published 20 years ago, but it's only brought me grief and nobody understands it. Why do you want me to write about it? And I said, Richard, we need it in plain English. We need it in my next book, in the section 2 about towards a new theory of climate. Now, a lot of people find that section 2, with the Lindzen chapter, the Reid chapter, the Svensmark chapter, the Duffy chapter really difficult, and that's fine, but at least it's there. And for people who enjoy the technical aspects of climate change, they'll enjoy that. And then the last section, Real Science and Our Failing Institutions, is about a lot of the policy implications of the bad science. So we have to get back onto carbon dioxide and homogenized temperature records and how they fiddle the sea level data and how they remodel it. So a lot of people and a lot of your readers may really enjoy the third section. The last chapter, and it talks about funding of science. The very last chapter, chapter 20, is called A Descent into Skeptics' Hell. A Descent into Skeptics' Hell, and it's a brilliant chapter, and it's all about I don't know how many of your readers are interested in English literature, but and Dante's wonderful poem about anyway, it talks about how difficult life can be as a skeptic, and it talks about how there's levels of skepticism. So Bjorn Lomborg, for example, he always goes with the official data, and he gets so far into into what it is to be a skeptic. But Bjorn's always said to me, Jen, you never want to sort of query the official data, because then you can sort of be accused of, getting into, what do they call it, when you really when you say that maybe there's a conspiracy. I'm not saying there's a conspiracy out there. I just show that the official data gets homogenized, right? And so what I do is I don't worry about like what people call me. I just go with the data. So I end up falling further and further down into what they call skeptics' hell. I think you've been there as well, haven't you, David? You're right down there. You just go with the data. Don't worry about what people call me. But it can result in you being sacked from universities, as happened to Peter Reid, and so it goes on. But the truth seeker, the real truth seeker, our lives are not necessarily easy. We may not have lots of mainstream friends, but hey, we've got friends and there's a big network out there, isn't there?
There certainly is. And that book sounds fantastic, especially the entire second section with all that particle forcing that's been left out of climate models forever. The work of Svensmark has been so important from the decades ago when he was attacked by suggesting potentially that cosmic rays cause cloud nucleation, which was proven at CERN by the people who called him out on it. They proved in the cloud experiment his very work was true. And now he's back, baby, and he's in the book. I love it. So everyone, grab that book. Jen, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Let's do this again soon, shall we?
Absolutely. I want to show you some pictures of Myrmidon Reef, and maybe I'll get you a better clip that's sort of like got lots of pretty corals. Maybe that last clip that I gave you was a little bit too technical. But you know, there's inshore reefs that are a bit dirty water, and there's outshore reefs that have got crystal clear water. But you know what? I love them all. You know, we shouldn't be frightened of a bit of mud in an inshore reef, because that has an important it has its place. Mangrove forests, you know, they're muddy, but they're really important for fish breeding and fish habitat, and you can get coral reefs right beside them. A lot of beige brown corals, but you know what, they're important, and I think they're beautiful corals too.
Yeah, and what the most important thing is that you're actually still doing science in the face of all the propaganda and all the pushback from the mainstream charlatans. There's still actual good science continuing through your work, and we appreciate you for that, Jennifer. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.